Đầu tiên tôi xin được gửi lời chào đến các bác sĩ tham dự buổi hội thảo Tâm Đức Hospital Scientific Conference. Tôi xin cảm ơn bác sĩ Đinh Đức Huy và các bác sĩ của Bệnh viện Tâm Đức đã tổ chức buổi họp hội thảo hôm nay. Đề tài của tôi là Turbulence caused by collision of the antegrade against the retrograde flow and recurrent mechanical injury as mechanism of coronary arteries. The outline, we will talk about turbulent flow and growth of endothelial cells from the intima. The second part is, how did the lesion form at the mid-right coronary artery, at the distal right coronary artery, proximal to the origin of the PDA, at the outer curve of the proximal circumflex, and at the osteon of the PDA or diagonal of this marginal. All our works are based on the Reynolds formula for turbulence, and two major components of the formula is diameter and the speed. The higher the diameter, the larger the diameter, and the higher is the speed, the higher the Reynolds number. As we see here, the vascular endothelial cells are formed based on the flow, the type of flow. Is it laminar or is it turbulent? Is it steady or is it pulsatile? So if we have laminar flow on the border of the arteries in the intima, then the flow is good and there is no lesion. If there is turbulent flow, then we can have formation of lesions. Now, question one, why the mid-right coronary artery is the most common fast-growing lesion? It is because the RCA is the most common location of turbulence. There is recurrent collision between the antegrade and retrograde flow and the transition between diastole. Here it is a series of 8 Coronary angiogram, as we do, image are recorded or 0.06 per image. Now we have image A. The artery is fully with contrast in black. And in figure B, at the red arrow, we see the blood in white color moving in just at the osteon. Now we go to C. We see the blood in white moving further, and in D, in diastole, the flow runs very quick and arrives to the mid-RCA where we see the lesion. Now let's look at E. At E, we see that the flow almost stopped there because this is the beginning of systole, and we see the contrast in black at the mid-segment of the right coronary artery. This is the location of collision between the antegrade flow of the blood and retrograde flow of the contrast. And we see the white color, white arrow. We see darker contrast. It shows that there is retrograde flow up to the osteum of the right coronary artery. And again, even the flow move forward, we still see the contrast stagnant at the mid-segment of the right coronary artery. This is the area of turbulence, and this is the cause of intimal injury starting the formation of coronary plaque. So what about interventional cardiology implication? What we learn from this result, from the above mechanism, as we see that the inner curve, the inner border of a curve, the blood pressure is lower. As we see, we call in this manometer. So the lesion is formed at the inner border of a curve. Let's say now we have an acute occlusion of acute MI. Where do we point the tip of the wire? The tip of the wire has to follow the outer curve because this is where the lumen is. Now, let's go to question 2. Why did a lesion form on the distal right coronary artery and proximal to the origin of the PDA and PLB? We saw that in this patient, why the lesion did not happen at the mid-segment like I just described. This patient, the lesion is at the distal PDA and proximal to the origin of the PDA and the PLB. So we call the mechanism of water hammer shock. It is we have a tank, the fluid, pipe connecting to the tank, and a valve at the end. If we close the valve abruptly, the flow continues to move forward and compresses and bounces back at the figure C. And when it bounces back, it will hit the anterate flow and the area of collision. This is the area we have the injury. This is what happened to the lesion, distal right coronary artery, but proximal to the PDA and PLB. Now in this scheme, and we see that in systole, the flow reverses. In diastole, it is antegrade. But in systole, it is retrograde flow, and the flow back and have a separation zone. And this area have recurrent flow, reverses flow, and turbulence. And this is the area with intimal injury, and this is the cause of the lesion at the distal right coronary artery, but proximal to the PDA and PLB. Now, let's go to see real life. Here it is, we have the distal right coronary artery with a large PDA, and you see that in the arrow, you see almost everything is black with contrast. The blood will move in white color. Now let's see. Next one, then we see the blood moving forward at the white arrow. More, the blood moves forward at the white arrow. Please remember these are the consecutive images. 0.06 second per image, or 15 images per second. Now, the next one, we see the reverse flow due to contraction of the left ventricle. And we see the black color of contrast flow back past the origin of the PDA. And now forward again, because in systole, this is not very strong systolic contraction, so the endocrine flow still prevails. And this is the mechanism for lesion in the distal right coronary artery, but proximal to the origin of the PDA or PLB. Now, at question 3. Now let's go to a different mechanism here. The lesion, why a lesion is formed at the outer curve of the left circumflex. We all the time see this kind of lesion, and we just don't pay attention about that. But clearly, there is a small lesion there. Now, what is the mechanism of the lesion at the outer curve of a side branch? In this case, of the left circumflex. The mechanism is separation, then recirculation, and turbulence at the outer curve of the side branch. When the flow comes to a bifurcation, the majority of the flow will go to the primary branch. At the secondary branch or the side branch, there is recirculation, separation of the layers, and turbulence right at the proximal segment at the outer curve. This is what we used to see for the at the osteum circumflex. Here it is the mechanism of separation, of recirculation of the innermost layers. If the flow is fast, and if the diameter of the artery is large, the flow can become turbulent easily due to recirculation. So this is why, what can we apply with what we just learned in interventional cardiology? There are two things in here. Number one, if the angle between the axis of the main artery, in this case the left main, it is either the LAD or the circumflex. If the angles is large, then the body needs higher speed and more energy to turn the corner. This is why if we do a PCI for bifurcation lesion, if the angle is smaller, it is better. And another one it is, if we do, after we do PCI for bifurcation lesion, we have to give the patient beta blocker, as in any case after PCI, because beta blockers decrease the speed and constrict the arteries. By that, we lower the Reynolds number. Because as you see in the formula, the Reynolds number depends on the speed and diameter. If the diameter is lower and the speed is lower, then the Reynolds number is lower, and we have less recirculation, less separation of layers, and less turbulence. Now, number 4, how did the lesion form at the ostium of the side branch? The PDA, diagonal, or obtuse marginal, or PLB? This is my latest discovery. This patient, I did an angiogram for him just last week. Here we You see clearly the lesion. There is a small lesion, small narrowing at the ostium of the PDA, as seen by the white arrow. Now, let's see. Now, this is a slow run of angiogram, and we will see that the distal RCA, which is in the AV groove between the right ventricle and the left ventricle, so it does not have any contraction. But look at the contraction of the PDA, and you will see why there is a lesion at the connecting site between the PDA and the RCA. This is why I call this is the hinge lesion. Now let's see. We see the contraction of the PDA. More, stronger, stronger. This is for the in systole. Now in diastole. Begin to relax, larger, more elongated, more elongated. And this is, and the area with a lot of stress, it is at the connecting site between the PDA and the RCA. This is why I call it the hinge lesion. In summary, I would like to share the latest part of my research. All the time I use the data based on the Reynolds formula about turbulence. And we talk about why there is a lesion in the mid-right coronary artery. And we see that, and we know how to point the tip of the wire when we try to cross a lesion. Number two, we see that there is a lesion proximal to the origin of the PDA and PLB. If we control the blood pressure very well, if the contraction of the systolic in the ventricle is not as abrupt, then we may decrease the collision at the distal right coronary artery and cause less lesion in the distal RCA. Now, number three, we see that there is a lesion at the osteon of the circumflex and the outer curve. The mechanism is separation, recirculation, and turbulence. And at the end, the latest the discovery from my work, it is a hinge lesion due to recurrent and persistent contraction of the PDA with the lesion at the insertion site of the PDA to the RCA. Thank you very much.